Hello and welcome to this session on technology, advice and information to support care. I'm Kate O'Loughlin from the University of Sydney and I'm very pleased to be here to chair this session. We have 4 excellent papers and presentations to listen to around this theme of technology and care, opportunities, obstacles in place-based care context. The overall theme, but today we're hearing about technology advice and information to support care from our presenters. So I would like to introduce our first presenter, who is Jo Moriarty from King's College London. And Jo's presentation is on carers' access to social care support in England. So welcome, Jo, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kate. I'm going to talk about a study that we've just completed, which was for the Department of Health and Social Care, which looked at the impact of the Care Act in England. And can I have the next slide, please, Sandra? Just to say that the study aimed to look at the extent to which the Care Act was a really important piece of legislation in England, which was intended to try and put, as the minister at the time said, to put carers and those they cared for on an equal footing. And so the actual act was heralded with a lot of sort of hope and optimism that it would lead to improvements in services for carers. And we were asked to evaluate the support provided to carers after the Care Act was implemented in April 2015. Next slide, please, Sandra. Obviously, I'm just talking as just a member of a bigger research team from researchers based at the London School of Economics and King's College London. Next slide, please. It was a multi-method study which included questionnaires, surveys, secondary data analysis. But what I'm going to talk about is an audit we did of local authority websites. This is the part of local government in England that is responsible for assessing carers' needs and providing information to them. But first of all, before I talk a little bit about what we found from the website, I need to say a little bit about government policy about online services and the barriers to digital inclusion in England. Next slide, please. So this is actually what the Act itself said. It placed a duty on local authorities to provide information and support for carers, and it explained that this was a duty that local authorities had to make sure that they had a good information system in place to provide for carers. Next slide, please. Before that, I think it's important to remember that how the government anticipated this information would be provided was what a policy they call digital by default. So the assumption is that everything will be provided online rather than perhaps through the sort of traditional system of handing out leaflets or doing sort of or posters in various sort of public places. Next slide, please. So one of the things that all sounds very, sorry, I'm not doing very well here. It's quite nerve-wracking. Obviously, one of the big issues is about digital inclusion is how many people have got access to the internet, if that's going to be your default way of providing services. Well, the Office for National Statistics has shown that the proportion of people in the UK who have never used the internet or last used it over 3 months ago has been falling steadily. But next slide, please. What's important, though, is among those who haven't used the internet, there are certain groups are disproportionately overrepresented. So in particular, when we're thinking about carers, we know that people who in single person households, people with lower incomes and people with disabilities are underrepresented among people who have access to the internet. People traditionally talk about older people being digitally excluded, but actually the number of older people who don't have access to the internet has been falling steadily. It's more among other groups that we see these gaps appearing in terms of internet access. Next slide, please. So I just thought I'd give an example here, just to try and make it clear about the cost of internet access. So I just did a quote yesterday from a website, and this is the best price you could get per month for broadband. And it might seem initially, well, £25 a month doesn't seem too much, until you remember that somebody who is on universal credit, which is the basic service for people who are unemployed or who are unable to work, is only £400 a month for a single person and £600 for a couple. So that £25 is quite a big part of people's income. Next slide, please. The other thing we have in the UK is a digital divide in terms of geography. So again, I'm using where I live in South London as an example of quotes you could get for broadband, and I'm using somewhere in Exmoor, which is in the southwest of England, and you can see immediately that people who live in my area can get many more deals, and most importantly of all, if we look at the bottom right hand corner, we can see that if you live in the southwest of England, your access to high-speed internet is much more restricted. Next slide, please. You might also say, well, people don't need broadband. They can get it on their mobiles, on their smartphones. Well, that's true, but this is an example of what you'd have to pay per month for mobile data. And remembering that 4 gigabytes or 5 gigabytes doesn't go very far in terms of how much you'll be able to access. Next slide, please. So that's just to explain a little bit about the context. So what we tried to do was to do a mystery shopping exercise where we looked at websites, local authority websites, and looked at what they said about information services for carers, and to see, well, what would we see if we were a carer? What information's here? What information do we think is missing? Thank you. Next slide, please. And I just want to give an example. We looked at about 79 authorities in England, which is it was almost half of the local authorities who have responsibility providing social care services. And just to give you an example about the variability, so we know from research that many carers don't recognise their carers. So in some ways, it's a positive finding that so many websites did include a definition of carer. We also know that young carers are less likely to recognise themselves as carers and to access services. So in most of the websites that we looked at, they did mention specifically that young carers would have needs. Given that the Care Act placed such a responsibility on local authorities to provide information to carers, and that a carer's rights to an assessment was such an important part of the Act, it's perhaps surprising that only about just over half of the authorities we looked at in terms of their websites explained to carers that they had a right to an assessment, and this was something that they could always ask for. There was a little bit more information about the assessment process, less information about who would be completing the assessment, because one of the things that's happened a lot in England is that responsibility for completing assessments of carers have been outsourced to voluntary organisations, so that in fact it wasn't always clear on websites that in this particular authority your assessment might be carried out by Carers UK or another local organisation. The other thing that is, I think, really surprising is how few authorities actually referred to the waiting times for assessments. We know from research undertaken by Carers UK that actually carers can wait quite a lot of time waiting for an assessment, but hardly any of the authorities we looked at on their website said you can expect to wait, 2 or 3 weeks for an assessment. So people could request an assessment, fill in a self-assessment form online, but then they would have no idea about when the assessment would actually take place. The other thing in terms of carers' rights to support, and again, only about just over half of the websites that we looked at explained to carers that they would be able to apply for a direct payment for a service for themselves as a carer. So that could be money that carers could spend on, say going to a yoga class or going for, sort of any type of relaxation, something that was for them and wasn't for the service for the person for whom they cared. And obviously this is another bit which isn't very clear, so I'm going to stop here and go back and say that obviously direct payments for carers have become an important part of the service that we would expect to see offered to carers, and it was rather surprising that only about half of the websites we looked at explained to carers that they did have a right to apply for a direct payment for themselves to enable them to take a break from caring or to do any other type of leisure activity that they may have given up as a result of caring. The other thing that is important, I think, that websites should mention is emergency support for carers, because we know from research that's been carried out with carers that many carers are really, one of the things that really worries them is because they're often the only person providing care, what would happen to them if they needed to go into hospital or if they had some sort of an accident. And again, most of the authorities did explain that they would provide some sort of emergency support for carers, but about a quarter of them didn't. And then also thinking about caring within the overall context and remembering my point about the limited incomes that many carers have. It was perhaps surprising that not all of them mentioned welfare rights and benefits. So next slide, please. The other thing I think is important to mention is we also looked at the way that websites were laid out and whether they looked inviting. This particular example I've taken is from Coventry, which is a city in the Midlands in England. And I gave that as an example of something that looks inclusive, because we know from research about the way people relate to things. If people want to see something that reflects themselves, that's called the idea that if groups feel excluded from what they see as a typical carer, they won't think it applies to them. So this example from Coventry is a positive example of an authority that's tried to make their website look more inviting to carers and to encourage carers from different backgrounds to find out what services are available. But many of them were really very dreary and were sort of not laid out in a way that made it easy to read if you were somebody that perhaps had visual difficulties or something like that. Next slide, please. And so really the bit that I really want to make sure is that I really want to point out is that one of the points of the Care Act was that was to try and reduce what's called a postcode lottery. But in fact, if you look at the way that websites are, the differences between websites, they really need to ensure that the content reflects carers' concerns. So for instance, we know that it is a real concern for carers about what happens in an emergency. None of us like waiting for, I'm going to start again, I'm making a wobbly here. It's really important to let carers know how long it will take to get an assessment. It can be very stressful for carers if they're not sure what sort of time spans they're operating under, and if they've said they want to have an assessment, when will they actually get one? And then a final point in terms of what's happened within England over the last few years is that local authorities have got have been badly affected by cuts to real term cuts in terms of social care, and most services are means tested now. But there's a real disincentive for carers if they assume that everything is means tested, they can be put off from applying for a service. I haven't explained that really very well, so I'm going to start again and say one of the things that's really important for carers is to have some understanding about if they are going to apply for a service, will they have to be means tested to get it, or is it a universal service like a carer's discount card or a card that enables carers to use local leisure centres for free? And one of the things that the local authority websites didn't mention was whether a service would be means tested or not. Next slide, please. I just want to point out here that this is from the main part of the study to say that one of the things that we can't make the connection between the data from the websites and this national data, which is what local authorities do in terms of how they report to NHS Digital. But we can see that there has actually been a reduction in carer assessments since the Care Act, even though people assumed it would lead to an increase. Next slide, please. We can also see that there's been a reduction in real-term expenditure on services for carers. Next slide, please. And then finally, we can see that there's been a reduction in the number of services provided to carers, including information. Next slide, please. And perhaps unsurprisingly, with all these reductions, there's been an increase in the number of carers who report that they're dissatisfied with what their local authorities provide. Next slide, please. So really, I think it's important to say that although the Act did have some positives in terms of improved clarity about the role and responsibilities of the state, in fact, it hasn't led to greater access in support for carers. Next slide, please. So really, what we're taking this forward, I think it's really important for us to look at whether carers do experience a digital divide. Often, as I've said, all the information we've got about digital exclusion is about groups of people, but not about carers. What are the links between information quality and the use of services, so that we know that carers often consult organisations for specific conditions, such as the Alzheimer's Society for help, rather than they're looking at to see what their local authority says about services for carers. But what happens if you're caring for somebody who doesn't have a diagnosis, or there isn't an organisation for that, but people with that particular diagnosis? And then finally, to say it's really surprising how local authorities haven't taken on board the opportunities for finding out information in terms of, when do carers look for help? What else do they look at? There's so many things we know in terms of the information that's collected by commercial organisations from us, and yet we're not doing this in terms of the public sector and services for carers. Next slide, please. That's just to give a link to what I've said earlier, and it isn't important in terms of the presentation. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening to me, and just to point out that to acknowledge the help of the Department of Health and Social Care in terms of funding the study, but to point out that the views expressed today are those of the researchers and not those of the Department of Health and Social Care. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Jo. Most interesting paper, and just a reminder of the expectation that we all have access to internet. That's where, we will find out anything we need to know. Common to Australia as well, and I'm sure there'll be discussion about this later. So thank you very much for that presentation. Our next presenter is Alhassan, and he is a researcher at the National Italian Centre for Socio-Economic Research on Aging in Ancona in Italy, and a PhD student at Marche, Polytechnic University. And Alhassan's presentation is Information and Communication Technology, so ICT, based solutions for formal carers and challenges to be addressed. So welcome, Alhassan, and over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. As has been said, my name is Alhassan. I am a Marie Curie Fellow and Researcher at INRCA, the Italian National Institute of Health and Science on Aging, and a PhD candidate at Marche Polytechnic University. I am delighted to be presenting in this session the work on information and communication technology solutions for informal carers and the relevant challenges. This work is part from the EU-funded project Entwine. The aim of Entwine's project is to investigate a broad spectrum of challenges in informal care and issues concerning the use of innovative interventions that support informal care. Next slide, please. Today's presentation is based on my recently published paper in the peer-reviewed journal JMIR on the challenges of the deployment of ICT solutions for informal carers. The aim of this study was to review literature to explore the challenges of the deployment of ICT-based support solutions for informal carers and provide relevant recommendations on how to overcome these challenges. A scoping review methodology was used following the INRCA and OMLE methodological framework to map the relevant literature. And as you can see, this is the outline of the presentation. I will be giving a quick background and speak a little bit on some of the benefits of ICT solutions for informal carer on both the micro and the macro levels. Then we will go through some of the needs of informal carers that might be addressed by ICT and some of their concerns about the use of ICT as well. Then we will speak on some of the challenges and the recommendations for the deployment of ICT solutions for informal carers. Next slide, please. I will use Barbapella's definition on ICT-based support solutions for informal carers, as they defined it as a service provided by any private or public organization that address carer and or care recipient needs through technological devices. Informal carers need reliable sources for information, and ICTs may provide informal carers with remote access to information and training about caring-related issues through websites and online training materials. Hence, the information and communication technology, or let's say ICT-based solutions, have the potential to support informal carers in home care delivery. However, there are many challenges to the deployment of these solutions. Next slide, please. Now, let's go through some of the benefits that ICT solutions may provide to informal carers. Next slide, please. On the micro level, research showed that ICT solutions can improve psychological outcomes in informal carers. ICT solutions may reduce carer depression, anxiety, stress, burden, as these solutions increase positive aspects of caregiving, carers, self-efficacy, and confidence. They provide informal carers with personal support and social networking system for peer support, which may decrease the burden of care. Research showed that ICT solutions have also macro-level benefits, as these solutions may help in the integration of informal and formal care. We can see that in the next slide, please. So as we can see, ICT solutions have also macro-level benefits. As we can see in the through the slide, they can help in integration of informal and formal care through the reduction of inappropriate hospitalizations and lengths of stay. Consequently, the deployment of this solution may generate savings, contribute to the sustainability of the care system. Next slide, please. Now, let's explore the picture further from the carer's side and see some of the needs of informal carers that might be addressed by ICT. Next slide, please. Informal carers need reliable sources of information. ICT solutions may provide information resources to informal carers to support the care tasks performed by them. Nevertheless, many ICT solutions lack specificity. Informal carers report difficulties in finding specific and up-to-date information related to their care situation, which adapts to changing needs over time. And it was really interesting to see Jo's presentation, and she highlighted some facts about this point actually. ICT solutions should provide dynamic, flexible, and more customizable content. ICT solutions should provide dynamic, flexible, and more customizable content. The content introduced on ICT solutions for informal carers should be personalized, tailored, and specific to informal carer individual situations. Feedback loops should be integrated in the different solutions to improve tailoring and allow the content to be adaptive to the changing needs over time. Next slide, please. Informal carers need ICT solutions that help them checking and monitoring the care recipient. These solutions are valued by informal carers as they update them about the care recipient daily behaviors and allow informal carers to have a peace of mind. These type of solutions can allow the maintenance of a paid job by the carer and thus contribute to guarantee their family financial stability. Next slide, please. Now moving to some of the concerns of informal carers about the use of ICT. Informal carers avoid spending too much time in learning how to use a new technology. Informal carers are a group of people for whom time is typically strained, hence they prefer simple and easy to operate technologies. When carers spend longer times providing care tasks, they don't have the time or energy to search for information and seek support via ICT solutions. This time consumption may overload the caregiving daily routines instead of supporting them and thus increase the burden. Next slide, please. Informal carers also have concerns on data ownership and the privacy of the data. Research shows that informal carers are concerned that they have uploaded personal information. This would compromise their safety, and there might be the possibility of other people reading and accessing their private notes. You can see here a quote from one of the studies. There are obviously, as you can see in the quote, there are ethical issues around who held the power of choice to use and discontinuous of ICT solutions. Next slide, please. We will now go through some of the challenges and the recommendations for the deployment of ICT solutions. Next slide, please. Digital illiteracy. So, digital literacy is a set of skills associated with the use of ICT that every individual should develop to be able to perform in a computerized society. Many informal carers are middle-aged to older people with a low to middle educational level, and these socio-demographic characteristics are often associated with a low level of digital skills, which could prevent them from benefit from ICT. Research identifies digital illiteracy as a major challenge for informal carers, as it increases the need for additional time and effort to adopt new technology. Next slide, please. Hence, taking actions to build the digital skills of informal carers early in the caregiving process is crucial for optimal use of available ICT solutions. Next slide, please. We see another challenge here, which is the lack of interoperability and fragmentation of support solution. Interoperability is the ability of different information systems and devices to exchange data in a coordinated manner. The simplest example on lack of interoperability is when you have an Android phone and then your friend has an Apple iPhone. Imagine you would like to share a picture with your friend via Bluetooth. This is not going to work, as the Bluetooth systems on your phones, the Android One and the iOS on Apple, are not interoperable. Think on a higher level. Some countries lack standards and regulations regarding the deployment of ICT in healthcare, which leads to fragmentation of services, and many ICT solutions for informal carers lack the ability to exchange and make use of information among systems and software. Improving interoperability allows connecting informal carers and care recipients with multiple providers in the most care recipient-centered manner. When we integrate different solutions for informal carers, we avoid double recording of information and consequently improve the use of these solutions. Next slide, please. Exactly, we mentioned it. So next slide, please. Lack of awareness. Another challenge is the lack of awareness. Informal carers perceive a lack of relevant information on the available ICT-based support solutions and their benefits. The issue of the lack of awareness of ICTs may particularly pertinent to older informal carers, particularly applicable to older informal carers. This imbalance suggests that greater efforts need to be made to reach this population to show them the value of this technology for their specific needs. Also, more research is needed in order to provide recommendations for the policymakers on the potential of ICT for informal carers, with consideration for profiles of informal carers. Next slide, please. Yes, the next one, please. Another challenge is the sustainability and the lack of business model. The lack of business model and evidence on the long-term impact and sustainability of ICT solutions beyond trials and pilots leads to considerable variations in the perceived role and importance of such technologies from the point of view of both users and healthcare providers, as well as policymakers. Next slide, please. Hence, obtaining government support for ICT-based support solutions for informal carers will likely require strong evidence of successful and sustainable business cases. On the other hand, few ICT solutions have been translated into a deliverable and sustainable service. Further studies operating at a macro level are therefore essential to develop more rigorous proofs about the sustainability of ICT solutions. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to end by saying that ICT solutions have a great potential to support informal carers in home care delivery. Nevertheless, ICT solutions cannot solve all the problems. The following quote is by Stacy Gumonos, from EuroCarers, the European Association working for carers. ICT is one important component in the toolbox of support measures for carers. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Alhassan. A most interesting presentation, some very important messages that you have for us, but I hope also for policymakers and service providers. Again, assumptions made about use of technology, who can access it, all of those things that just aren't always very well thought through. So thank you for that presentation. Our third presenter is Andreas Hoff from the Zittau-Görlitz University of Applied Science in Germany. Andreas' presentation is the VATI Technology Navigator, Impartial Advice on Assistive Technologies for Older People, Family Carers and Care Providers in Germany. So welcome, Andreas, and over to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andreas Hoff. I'm Professor of Social Gerontology at Zittau-Görlitz University, and I'm going to present together with my colleague Bill Potthast a talk on challenges of using assistive technologies in home care for older people based on a research project we carried out there. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do within the next 15 minutes is, after a brief introduction on the specific challenges of older people using assistive technologies, I will introduce you the survey we carried out as part of the VATI study, which was informing the development of the VATI Technology Navigator we used to provide impartial advice to older people as well as their family carers, and I will end the talk with some brief conclusions. Next slide, please. So, older people and assistive technologies. Next slide, please. What I'm showing you here with this statistic from Germany is the use of the internet by age groups. Unsurprisingly, what you can see looking at the light blue colors, nearly 100% of people aged 16 to 24 years are using the internet. compared to those age 65 plus. That is quite a significant difference. 10 years ago, it was only a third of older people using the internet. 2015, it was nearly half. Next slide, please. It is worthwhile, however, to have a closer look at the older people. If you differentiate between people aged 60 to 69 on the one hand, and people aged 70 plus on the other hand, you see quite a substantial difference. Looking at the most recent data from 2018, 79% of those aged 60 to 69 were actually using the internet, which is not that far away from the younger people, whereas it was only roughly 43% for those aged 70 plus. Next slide, please. So what are the main challenges of using digital technology in old age? Among the most significant challenges are declining sensory abilities in old age. So impairments in vision, but also impairments in tactility. So it is less, older people might find it's more difficult to using touchpads, for example, because of that. So as a consequence, daily activities that make use of such technologies, or just simple activities like walking around that didn't require any attention when you are young, or when they were young, do now when they are getting old, and they require constant adaptation. Secondly, declining cognitive abilities. They occur on average much later than some personal managers may have thought, but they do occur, and they also make it more challenging to use assistive technologies. What makes it worse is that home environment and technology do not always match. For example, the German government estimates that about 2% of housing stock in Germany are fit in terms of senior citizens adaptation. So that leaves us with remaining 98% that need further adaptation to make them to fit with older people's requirements. So we all live in digital societies, in knowledge societies, and growing numbers of services are being digitized. You can, of course, see this as a major advantage, as a customer-friendly development, but when you are not used to using digital devices or digital services, this can be a challenge. So, as we all know, there are a number of services that are either entirely in digital ways nowadays, banking, or try to book a ticket for a train service without using a computer. It's hardly impossible nowadays. What makes it even more challenging is that once a digital solution is in place, let's say you can print out your train ticket, it's being replaced with an even more modern one. So nowadays you have to download it on your smartphone. And so they require constant readaptations all the time. So the good news is older people are, of course, capable of learning new things until old age, and they are capable of adapting to a new environment and to new challenges, but it is a challenge. So I will now introduce you to the VATI survey. VATI the acronym stands for Vertrauen in Assistenztechnologien zur Inklusion älterer Menschen, which means in English, trust in assistive technologies for social inclusion of older people. It was supported, sponsored by central government sources as well as regional government sources, which I herewith acknowledge. Next slide, please. The main objectives of this research project, which was carried out by both a team from social gerontology and from computer studies, was to establish a regional support network using assistive technologies and also providing impartial advice using a web-based technology navigator. And by providing this impartial advice, we were hoping to provide useful services for family carers, professional carers, and the people needing home help, assistance in their home environment themselves. And in order to inform the development of this navigator, we carried out a longitudinal survey, a regionally representative survey in Eastern Saxony first. So this survey was conducted in 2 waves. First wave between October 2015 and May 2016, using a standardized questionnaire and face-to-face personal interviews. And then a year later, second wave, just using computer-assisted telephone interviews. Next page, please. And these are some basic findings from that survey. Unsurprisingly, as I showed you earlier, based on national survey data, the vast majority of people aged 60 to 69 were using computer and internet. Still more than half of those aged 70 to 79 were using it, and a substantial minority of about 25% of those aged 80 plus were using the computer. So likewise with the internet, as you can see on the left-hand side, when we are talking about mobile telephones, it's quite impressive to see that not only 90% of those aged 60 to 69 were actually using a mobile telephone, but nearly 2/3 of those aged 80 plus. And well, equally impressive, but hardly surprising given the greater need, is that when it comes to health technology, such as blood pressure measurement, it's actually in the oldest age group that the majority, or it's actually in the oldest age group that the highest percentage is using it. That's more than 70%. Next page. So as you can see here, figures are far less impressive when it comes to using AAL or telecare devices. So I would like to point your attention to the second column from the left. That's an alarm system. Alarm system was used by about 4 to 5% in our survey. And given the fact that alarm systems have been around for 40 or 50 years by now, this is quite surprising. Next page, please. Also, when we talk about people being able and prepared to adapt their homes using new assistive technologies, it's equally frustrating. We only had 17% agreeing to do that question, and a stunning 83% said no, thank you, and no interest. We are not prepared to adapt our homes. Next page, please. When we talk about future scenarios of using assistive technologies, such as an assistant for reminding us, or for health measurements, especially a device reminding us to drink, or devices to prevent falls, it's far less impressive. The green indicates people are willing to use such devices now, and the red indicates no, thank you, we are not interested in this, and we will not be interested in this in future. So as you can see, especially when it comes to monitoring behavior, such as did you drink enough? Did you remember to drink enough? It's about 1/3 who rule out using assistive technologies for that purpose altogether. Next page, please. So summarizing the findings from our study, so the majority wants to stay in their own homes for as long as possible. There are few age-friendly homes. Many people reported that the geographical distances to their children and grandchildren is so much that it's hard to get any support in using assistive technologies. Hardly anyone knows about AAL technologies, and and if a need arises, a majority would be willing at least to think about it. But that's the only comfort where we can take from this. Next page, please. In the remaining 2 or 3 minutes, I would like to introduce you to the VATI technology navigator. Next page, please. So that's a landing page of our navigator. And it's particularly important to have this impartial advice. And that's what the navigator was developed for. Next page, please. If you use this web page, you will, using this hyperlink, you will get to our web page. Next page, please. And that's what it looks like when you come to the next page. So on, just look at the left-hand side. So that's basically the first introduction, the menu of Technology Navigator, and it guides, you can choose there if you want to be guided through the navigator using a questionnaire, or if you want to look at it using different functionalities, such as what you can see on the right-hand side. So different types of assistive technologies, or in the lower part of the page, if you want to look at assistive technologies available in the living room, in the bedroom, and so on. Next page, please. And that's what it looks like when using the questionnaire. So the questionnaire will ask questions such as, are you living on your own? Are you suffering from vision impairment, and so on? And then the navigator will suggest different types of technology. Next page, please. And for example, provide you with more detail on the specific technologies. Next page, please. So, and also supplementing our technology navigator, we now also have an AAL lab, which is in this area of sheltered accommodation. Next page, please. And that's what it looks like from inside. So people can not only get impartial advice using the navigator, they can also visit us in our lab and test the technology by themselves. Next page, please. If you visit this website, you can actually get a tour of our AAL lab, and it's both in English and German. So please come and visit us there. Next page, please. I will skip this in the interest of time. Next page, please. Conclusions and outlook. Next page, please. Concluding, what are the preconditions for sustainable assistive technologies in home care? First of all, think from the older consumer's perspective when designing assistive technologies, and also when introducing services based on assistive technology. Secondly, employ seniors technology ambassadors, because they know best how to use them. Secondly, provide advice as often as requested by the user. Sometimes a second time or third time will be enough, but sometimes they may require 5 times or even 10 times. Every visit and every turn is useful and is precondition for using assistive technologies. Thirdly, it's extremely important to integrate assistive technologies into existing support networks, and that's both formal and informal, meaning both family carers and professional carers. and that's precondition for assistive technologies to work. And it's extremely important to keep in mind that they are there to assist the carers and not to replace them. And finally, don't take for granted that you will have fast internet everywhere, especially when you when you visit rural areas, both in the UK and in Germany. You will find that this cannot be taken for granted. Thank you very much for your attention. Next slide, please. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. The most interesting paper, and I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion about that. Our fourth and final presenter today in this session is Millie Petrovic. Millie is from University Cattolica in Milan and is presenting to us on the potentiality of advanced positive technology for dealing with psychosocial stress in caregiving, evidence-based treatment in Italy. Welcome, Millie, and over to you.
Hello, everyone. I am Millie, a researcher and a PhD candidate at the Catholic University of Sacred Heart. I will introduce the theoretical background of used for the development of transformative video storytelling for informal caregivers that is then applied in video and audio stories. Can we have a next slide, please? So, following our outline for today, I will be addressing the theoretical background mostly because we would like to demonstrate the rationale for using the video storytelling and audio storytelling for informal caregivers. However, I will not really be discussing the technique itself. So if you're interested in technique, I'm really happy to talk about it. You can always reach out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this image is actually one of the most accurate representation of informal care because it depicts an elderly couple stepping into the maze. So it's completely unknown, it's unexpected, and most of all, it's unwanted by most caregivers and care recipients, and it resembles the caregiving role in general. And this image is also a representative of a sort of a dissociation between a straight line that our life is imagined to be and the actual road that it turns out to be. Can we have a next slide? Thank you. So McAdams and colleagues posed a very valuable theory within the field of narrative psychology, which we used as a basis for structuring caregiver life story in our own project. The theory of narrative identity introduces the notion of self by arguing how identity is being formed over a course of time through episodic particulars of autobiographical memory. And in essence, people convey who they are, who they were, and who they might become by sharing the reconstructed past and imagined future of themselves. And if we think of our own personal story, we can find sort of a connection between what we planned to be and who we became. And in case of caregivers, they never expected to become a caregiver. For example, a daughter never expects to become a caregiver of her mother. And in many cases, in interviews that we had with caregivers, the daughters were reporting that I became a mother of my own mother, which, if we understand as a potentially stressful and traumatic experience, we can focus on how these potentially stressful and traumatic experiences are actually structured within the narrative identity of the self. And we approach in our project the experience of informal caregivers through narrative perspective, with a special attention on how the role is structured and narrated by the informal caregivers. So our goal is to help informal caregivers create a positive and clearly structured personal story within the caregiving role by using a fictional caregiving life story, which is gender adapted most of all, and such therapeutic story is serving as a potential trigger for self-structure within the narrative identity of self. Could we have a next slide, please? Okay, can we go also to the next slide? We'll go back to this one. Yeah, thank you. So following the transformative experience design as a conceptual framework, we use new media such as video and audio storytelling as a tool for creating transformative stories and immersive narrative contents that facilitate the reflection of one's life story. So in this manner, we provide an opportunity for self-restructure, allowing positive adaptation to the caregiving role. Maybe we could go to the previous slide now. Thank you. So the therapeutic caregiver life story is structured according to the Freytag's pyramid. This pyramid is actually the oldest dramatic structure of the story plots, revealing the basis of each dramatic story in the literature. And following the Freytag's pyramid, we provide a fictional story with a clearly presented beginning, rising action, as you can see in the picture, such as emotional or psychological challenges. Climax is a critical point within the caregiving role, and a resolution through provision of coping skills. Could we go to the next slide? Okay, so in conclusion, building on these concepts and involving informal caregivers in creating a fictional, or in other words, universal caregiver life story, we provide a structured story starting with the role onset, following the general challenges caregivers experience within the role. And these challenges ultimately lead to a critical point within the story that are visible as a climax, and here as a critical point in the image on the right. And through the use of technology, we turn this critical point into semi-interactive content, allowing users to shape and affect the development of the resolution itself. Could we have a next slide? So in this manner, the caregiver is an observer of a general life story that is highly relatable to his personal life, but depicted as a fictional story and in a third-person perspective, which allows emotional distance and the objective stance towards the story. So on the other hand, the critical point shifts and draws the observer into the first-person perspective, into the protagonist, putting the caregiver in the story in charge of the resolution of the conflict or the critical point within the story. And the current development of the video and audio story for informal caregivers is still ongoing. And we expect the first pilot trial to take place at the end of 2021. Could we have also next slide? So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I managed to briefly introduce the general idea of transformative interactive storytelling and raise maybe your interest in the further development of our project. You may follow us here on the right. You may follow us on Twitter and get updates on our progress of transformative storytelling, both authors, me and the Professor Andrea Gaggioli.
Thank you, Millie. A most interesting study, and I would definitely like to hear more about it, and I'm sure there'll be some discussions. We now welcome back Alhassan as our discussant. So You've been a presenter, Alhassan, and now you're going to bring us up to make some insightful comments, I'm sure, in your role as discussant. So over to you.
Thanks everyone for the excellent presentations. This session addresses how technology solutions may support care and the challenges of using digital technology in home care. In different ways, the papers suggest that technology may provide opportunities to support aging in place. This is the case whether it's a tool to disseminate information about what support is available to carers, as Joe described, whether it can assist with the balance between care and paid work for those supporting others, as I mentioned, whether it may increase the quality of life and social participation of older people by enabling them to a higher degree of independent living in their private homes, as Andreas suggested, or whether it helps in reducing carers' stress using transformative experience design as Millie presented. The papers indicate growing momentum behind the idea that technology has the potential to support informal carers in home care delivery. This, however, has implications for care, which technology can disrupt its more traditional aspects, such as proximity and personal touch. We are also observing a shift in policy and practice over time, as increasingly digital devices are used in care arrangements. By necessity, as analog solutions become obsolete, but also as part of a drive for innovation, bringing new challenges of regulation, ethics, privacy, and risk, as well as issues related to the digital divide in the skills to use and access to these devices, with implications for practice. One of the issues raised by Joe was the cost of internet and the lack of adequate infrastructure. The issue is highlighted in literature. Douglas et al. Suggested that poor connectivity to the internet, particularly in rural areas, is a barrier to the use of any technological or digital solution delivered over the internet. Poor digital infrastructure and underperforming internet connection is also a concern for research with technology solutions and possibly an exclusion criterion for participants in efficacy and effectiveness trials. Governments and policymakers should allocate funding for improving digital infrastructures. Joe has also mentioned the issue of digital divide and inequality. Informal carers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds may be less able to use technology-based support solutions. The literature identifies a potential social justice issue if governments don't value these support solutions and the user-based implementation must be used for technology solutions. This would then limit the accessibility of the solutions to only those who can afford to pay. In order to address these issues, digital inclusion policies should be promoted and to foster continuous development of digital competences in informal carers. In previous study on the use of web-based services for carers, Lamora et al. Highlighted the importance of improving older carers' digital literacy based on an early assessment of their needs and digital skills. As mentioned by Andreas, research showed that older adults are capable of learning and acquiring digital literacy skills as long as they know the functional benefits related to technology. In this regard, it's important to combine the utility of the internet with the expertise of medical professionals, including care support hotlines, also to improve informal carers' trust in technology solutions and their functional benefits. An important lesson learned from Andreas' work leading to the technology navigator is that the design process plays an important role in technology use, acting as a barrier or as a facilitator. Many carers experience difficulties in navigating technology solutions due to the complexity of the design of technology. This is partly due to the fact that carers are not included in the design of technology solutions, even though these solutions should be co-designed with end users. This type of design may constrain informal carer behavior accordingly and inadequately reflect their needs as a users of technology. In this regard, it's important to implement user-centered and participatory design strategies. In this regard, it's important to implement user-centered and participatory design strategies. Implement features that only add value for carers should be considered, and we should avoid designing extra services of which not all are necessary. Designers should involve older carers in the design process as much as possible, as opposed to simply testing with younger demographics. Technology solutions that are user-friendly for younger adults may not be user-friendly for older users. This is in line with the literature recommending to identify how technologies are incorporated into the everyday lives of informal carers and care recipients. In her presentation, Millie pointed out to the importance of assessing the deeper meaning-making needs that informal carers face, leading to psychological distress. Indeed, it's important to think more about how carers see themselves with technology. Ethical issues such as dehumanization of the care process by technology solutions and privacy protection of informal carers and their care recipient are repeated throughout the literature. Informal carers should be given the choice to accept or refuse access to technology solutions. In this regard, there is a necessity to involve healthcare professionals and family care advisors in the administration of these tools in order to enhance the experience of technology as a set of safe and secure tools. Due to rapid technological innovation, more research needs to be conducted and guidelines for designing and developing technology solutions should be made adaptable to continuous change as new tools become available and healthcare delivery systems experience a technologically supported transition toward home care. It's also important to assess whether certain characteristics of informal carers, such as their gender, relationship to the care recipient, health status, or socio-economic status, appear to make a difference in their use of technology-based support services. Understanding the socio-demographic and socio-economic profiles of informal carers could help improve the quality of technology solutions and tools by producing age or gender specific online information platforms. On the macro level, further studies are necessary to explore the availability, efficiency, and sustainability of technology-based support services. Research on impact at this level should be collected to complement those at user level and to convince policymakers to promote policy frameworks for the creation of technology-based support solutions for informal carers. That's it. Many thanks again for everyone for the thoughtful presentation.
Thanks to Alhassan. Now we invite all of our presenters to join us, and we can have some general discussion about the presentations, the issues raised. And, you know, for me, there was in some ways a common theme, of course, across the papers, very much about our reliance on technology, our assumptions about access and use of technology, and how it can be often quite almost thoughtlessly applied in areas of our lives. Now, that's not to say there aren't some positive things there, but I think we are probably all agreed that there also are major challenges. So I'll invite general comments and questions from everyone. And if not, I will ask some questions. How about that? Joe, to you, I'm interested, and your presentation just brought up many issues relevant to the Australian context as well. But I just want to confirm, so you're talking about England or the UK? England, is it?
Yeah, England.
Okay, so
because
all
health and social care is what they call a devolved matter. So that means that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, the governments there are responsible for their own, for their own
Okay,
decisions.
so you're looking at England. Yeah, and so each local government area or local council was responsible for putting together their own website information portal.
That's right.
For care, well, for anybody requiring care. And I guess because as national, anything to do with care is a national, particularly aged care and disability, is national. So we do have the information portal, but it is the one portal. Not saying that makes it necessarily the best portal, but at least it is a one avenue. Whereas you're saying, depending on where you are, your information might be more or less useful, informative, accessible.
That's right. I mean, obviously, you're right about that. The fact that there's a difference between when you've got one portal and lots of different portals. I mean, one of the examples that people often compare the NHS website in England, which has got very clear branding, everything looks the same. Whereas the variety between the local authority websites, which is something that's been confirmed by other researchers as well, it's just enormous, and it just depends upon, if you like, the enthusiasm they have had about making, and the knowledge they've had about sort of making websites look accessible and inviting. And it is a problem, though, the fact that they're so different, because there isn't, if you like, a basic standard that says you should cover this, this, and this. And there's certain material that actually could be written as a sort of a template. I mean, you could have a template and then everybody adapts that for the local thing, but that doesn't seem to have been the way that they've done it here so far.
So there's no sort of national league table of, who's doing it better.
Yeah, no.
That would be one way.
Probably just as well, really. But yeah, you're right. There isn't that, like when you, again, making that analogy with the private sector, there's so much concern about branding and so much concern about making something look the same. And just little things like you can, when you log on to a website and you order something, and then suddenly you get a little pop-up. How helpful was it? How easy was it to navigate around this website? And all those things like that are missing. And it's partly because they don't have the people that do the websites, they do it, they're not really updated very often. So that one of the things we found early on in the research was sometimes they actually were giving wrong information, whereas they don't have somebody, and it's partly a lack of resources thing, but it's also that worry about where do people go, where is a reliable information source for carers to go. I mean, obviously there are things like Carers UK, and that's a resource, but it is really hard, I think, for somebody who lives in an area. And if you're feeling stressed, like the things that Millie was saying about the story, about the narrative of care, that when you're feeling stressed, do you really want to plough your way through a really sort of website? Where do you go? And I think it also fits into what I really liked about the way that your presentation and Alhassan's presentation dovetailed together was this idea of a carer seeing themselves as somebody who was competent in technology and somebody who knew how to collect different sorts of information. And we know that that's a hard thing for many carers to feel. We know that lots of carers feel that they don't know enough about what's happening to them and they don't know enough about new technology. But I thought what was really nice hearing Alhassan and Millie talk after each other was the way that actually we need to think more about how carers think about themselves and the circumstances in which they're going to ask for help. And the point that Alhassan made about the necessity about, sort of help for carers to sort of get up to speed in terms of their IT knowledge.
Yes, that is, as I say, it's a common thread throughout the presentations. The other thing is that idea of, the carer in a stressed or distressed state. Is there no other way of seeking or getting your support or help or assistance? Do you have to start with the website? Is that the case with both Italy and England?
May I take this? Yeah, because we just have some preliminary findings. We interviewed a lot of caregivers that are visiting the Caregiver Association, and there are some common themes that we discovered, which is that the caregivers feel completely abandoned, and the social system is providing some sort of a support, but this support is definitely not enough. And we are not talking about the economical aspect of the role, but more concretely the personal support in understanding the individual. It's really what is lacking, and the issue is not that the caregiver is alone in his role. The issue is that once the role begins, a lot of family members as well withdraw. So it's a completely new level of abandonment. It's not just a social abandonment, but it's a sort of a role shift. But at the same time, it's a change in a family balance. So this is why we actually opted for video storytelling, because it requires really little knowledge of technology. And at the same time, it is providing sense of understanding, of support. And also, I think that if we manage to expand this and share through caregiving associations that are providing group support, free group support for informal caregivers, it can be really, it's not a solution, but it's a really valuable addition to the caregiving role.
And that point that Millie just made about carers feeling abandoned and often being the only one in their family, other people withdrawing, I think that's why that notion of emergency, knowing about how to access emergency support, becomes so important, because it's a real stress for carers when you feel. I remember going to interview her, and she looked after her mother who had dementia, and she had just broken her arm, and because she'd fallen over, and she was so stressed about that because there was nobody else who would be able to help her mother, and her mother needed quite a bit of physical care. And so I think that's why that idea about making when we think about the information carers need, we should link it more to the information that carers tell us that they need.
Exactly.
Rather than they want to know, but actually the things they do want to know. And I think that is an example of, emergency support is something that we know that very few people have got the family networks that mean that there is somebody else who can step into their shoes and take over that caring role if the carer is ill or if something happens to them. And then the points that Alhassan made about, we know about the demographics of carers who often are in the older age groups themselves, who may have a disability or a health problem. They're not necessarily always going to be somebody who's very young and fit and unlikely to be ill. In fact, they are likely to be ill.
And I think Alhassan's point about time poor, just the expectation that people have the time, the resources, everything to sit at a computer or access however they do it. It just doesn't always happen. Can't happen.
No. And if you are time poor, if you have got 10 minutes spare, you might want to make a cup of tea, just watch TV or do something relaxing. You don't really want to do thing that is sort of you see as hard, that is like work or could be difficult or something. You want to actually take that opportunity to sit down, don't you?
Just as a general point, given governments and organisations are so, everything is online. I mean, I joke with my students that our entire life, only half joking, our entire lives are online. And given that is the way governments are going, and some support organisations as well, is there then resources made available for people to gain the skills necessary? Are they subsidised in any way to get access to the internet? Jo, you made some important points about cost, affordability of all of this, whether it's money or time or whatever. So is it addressed in any way by government if they're putting this expectation on to caregivers or those requiring care? Are they then saying, well, we'll help you with this?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where the UK has been really affected by, obviously, coronavirus, because one of the things that, if you like, one of the good bits of our system was obviously the voluntary sector and the way that was very well developed. And organisations like Age UK would have centres where people could go to, and they would often run courses for people how to become more digitally literate, and they were obviously free and people could drop into them, and providing you knew about them. And also, most important of all, they gave people that sense of doing it with someone else, because at the beginning of this call, when we were all on our own, weren't we, and we were all, how do we click on this? I've not used this system before, and something goes wrong and you feel on your own. And even if I think that having somebody who can sit there and say, no, let's just go back, and that face-to-face contact when giving you advice and support makes a difference. But of course, all those services haven't been able to do it, and the assumption has been that everybody will be, will have to learn about something online, that you'll spend your time on YouTube learning how to do something, but you won't have somebody to sit and say, let's just have a cup of tea and go through this together, and probably be a lot easier.
Well, I think perhaps a final comment here is, again, back to Alhassan's presentation, where he reminded us that ICT, digital, internet, whatever we want to call it, is one form of support. It cannot be the only support, access to information, etc. We do need people. We do need drop-in places. I mean, that was a criticism of Australia's, national portal. But why isn't there a shop front? Why can we not get the bus, go down, walk in, sit down, and say, "This is what I want to talk about"? It's all go online, scroll through, get someone to help you if you can. Just, again, that whole challenging in terms of time, in terms of resources and so on. So I think, Alhassan's point of, it's good, it's important, but it is one source. We need to have it as part of a package of the resources that are needed for carers, caregiving, the whole caregiving context. So thank you, everyone, for a most interesting session. And I hope we can continue this conversation, whether it's here at the conference or just keeping in touch with each other, because we're all clearly working in this area and doing our very best for all those people who are carers. And I'm glad somebody mentioned this, because they are often quite overlooked in terms of the support they provide and trying to shape their own lives in some ways. So that was a good call. I think that was you, Jo, was it? Mentioning the young carers.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you, everyone. A fantastic session.
Thank
and
you.
I know there will be lots of further discussion on this.